Oh.
Okay, it's recording. Oh, just since not everyone knows Juliano here, though he has been, how do they call Benjamin in the Frankfurt School? Like a fellow traveler, right? He's been a fellow traveler in many ways already. He's joined us in a couple of meetings already, and I remember there was one meeting where in the end John and you were talking about different issues regarding state theory, what could be done, discussions on state and capital. So, I mean, I know privately from a lot of our conversations that there's a lot of overlay between our interests, and I invited Juliano to present a bit of his work here, also for a specific reason, which is it's not for nothing that we've been discussing for kind of exhaustively, right? The initial thesis of the paper we wrote together, and that they are mostly kind of backed by literature from Brazilian critical theory tradition. It doesn't have necessarily counterparts in kind of English-speaking scholarship, and not a lot of it is translated. So it is a bit of a kind of a wealth of discussions and material, and kind of a general point of view on things that I don't think is so kind of readily available. So I thought it was not only a good opportunity for us to hear Juliano on his research, but also, since I know it is also quite informed by this perspective, it was also a good opportunity for us to continue that same line of discussions we were having one way or another, you know. But I don't want to say too much. I mean, Juliano shared with us a text that he wrote that I felt was very appropriate for some of our discussions. I think we can, you know, pass you the ball, Juliano, and you can pick it up from there.
Okay. Can you hear me well? Great. Well, thanks, Gabriel, and thanks to all of you for this invitation. I suppose, well, I'll offer another thanks to Gabriel, first of all, for inviting me to participate in this study group. I have been attending somewhat infrequently over recent months, and usually lurking. Part of the reason for that is that it's the time that I happen to be putting my son to bed, so it's not always easy for me. So I've often got the camera off. But also the lurking bit is because I've been trying to really arrive and understand the approach of the group and learning with you and from you. And as I must say, so far, as I've been able to follow sessions, join in sessions, I found it fascinating, and not just on account of the content, but I think learning a different way of thinking, one that's quite different to mine, both in disciplinary terms, but also in terms of the starting points. I think the problems that you're tackling, that you're dealing with, are often problems that I've been concerned with, but you're coming at those problems often from different perspective. And when I talk about what ways of thinking, I suppose one of the most important ways that I'm observing and learning when I join these sessions is a particular approach to the development of rigorous and systematic theory, and I've had a long-standing interest, curiosity, fascination with theory, and I suppose starting with political theory, but then spreading out to other areas of theory, without ever necessarily wanting to develop theory myself in a systematic way, that I've been keen to, I suppose, propound theoretical concepts or engage with theoretical ideas and to know theory more than actually to develop theory. And I suppose there's a few reasons for this, and I'll just talk about them very briefly because I think it's relevant to the text that was shared and the way it was written. It was published last year, but I wrote it in 2020. I suppose the first reason is perhaps a lack of patience. That doesn't mean a lack of application to be able to read and write, but a lack of patience in the sense of wanting to expand constantly on things in a way that doesn't allow for a focus for long enough to develop something systematic. The other maybe is a lack of confidence, as one other theoretician or anti-theoretician, I suppose, in Brazil once said, that doesn't trust his bat, in a literal translation, non confio no taco. Maybe that's one of the reasons too. But I think there's a more substantive reason, which is that I've felt increasingly perhaps a reticence in my encounter with theory, and I say theory with a capital T here. Its dominance and its dominant forms, let's say, in the British Academy in particular. And I should say that I was born and raised in Britain, but I am half Brazilian as well. I now live in Brazil. So that was what Gabriel was referring to in some sense. But the way in which certain forms of theory have come to dominate intellectual production within the academy, and I suppose something of a paradox, which is that the dominance of theory, particularly postmodern theory, in the British Academy, happens at the moment when theory itself seems to become limiting, and that's perhaps because of the conditions of postmodernity, and feeling that there are limits to what can be achieved through theory, partly because I suppose I've seen often a significant value in a sort of counterintuitive method of raising questions without necessarily trying to establish a response to them. Questions that perhaps rational approaches don't necessarily have a response to, partly because the responses aren't determined only by structure and mechanism, but lay beyond and often in the realms of effect and even ideology. And so I suppose this value that I see in the counterintuitive method, or in what Brazilians might call pensando pelo avesso, thinking from behind in some way, is I suppose partly explicative of the approach that I took to this essay. In fact, just a funny anecdote. I think the greatest blooper of mine in a public event, it was about a year ago, has to do with the concept of pelo avesso, from behind. I was discussing this very same essay, talking about Fukuyama, and talking about how I buy in one respect his thesis on the end of history, but mixed metaphors across languages, across English and Portuguese. I said publicly that what I end up doing is embracing Fukuyama from behind, which obviously caused raucous laughter in the room. Anyway, back to the point. This essay. Thanks for inviting me to discuss this essay in particular. I mean, it is for those of you who have been able to read it or read a bit of it. You will have probably recognized that it's sprawling in some way, and I suppose rereading it now for the first time in a number of months, I was struck again by my ambition when I was writing it, and at the same time, it was an ambition with perhaps without pretense. I wanted to cover a lot of ground without necessarily, again, trying to answer the questions that I was proposing, and so whenever I've presented on this essay, I've presented particular aspects of it, usually at the request of whoever's invited me to speak on it. And at the same time, I think for this group, I get a sense that maybe what you might be most interested in is the totality of the thing. And if I were to try to present on the totality or all the contents of what I wrote in this essay, which I couldn't even do. I would certainly speak for much longer than is reasonable. So what I'll propose to do, I suppose, is say what I was trying to do and present just the main argument, and give, I suppose, some of what could be called the metadata of this essay, the background to it, the bits framing it. And then we can get into a discussion. You can take the conversation where you think is most useful to your existing work. So, what was I trying to do? The title, Notes on Our Melancholy Present. What was I trying to do? I suppose the most precise definition, although it's somewhat sophistic, I suppose, would be trying to provide a diagnostic of the time of the present in the conjunctural temporality of late or post-modernity. And what do I mean by that? I was trying to provide a characterization of the problem of presentism. And there was a premise there, obviously, the problem of presentism, its causes, its products, and its implications, but without situating myself anachronistically within a modernist teleology. And I suppose it's not just within this temporality that I was trying to work. I was also trying to write in a form that was reflective of my argument. And in fact, this is a condensed version of a longer essay that I'd originally written, which there's plenty of bits of it that I didn't end up publishing, in which I replicated my argument through the form. And this wasn't, I suppose, just a fun game that I was trying to engage in. There was an attempt to bring about a sense of the fragmentation and disorientation at the end of modernity through form that was then given clarity through the text. And why was this exercise of interest to me? That is, trying to offer this diagnostic. I suppose in the first instance, it was because I was responding to a situation, let's say after the deflagration of capitalist crisis in 2008, that led to or created a series of opportunities, and very quickly after, seemingly impasses for radical politics. And these impasses seemed to me to be reflective of a lack of imagination, which itself wasn't only a lack of imagination. A lack of imagination that was based in part on failures of organization, but also on the material conditions for imagining something different. And at the same time, recognizing that certainly in the Anglophone world, most of the conversation about what was going on, the instability, the turbulence in certainly Western capitalist democracies, but not only, was focused on what people were calling populism in its various guises. Certainly populism of the right, authoritarian populism, nationalist populism, ethno-nationalism, etc. And that this was often expressive of a set of anxieties about the end of something, and the end in particular of either liberalism itself or what had increasingly been called liberal order. And I say increasingly because, in fact, the term liberal order, if you look at an engram of its use, it's used much more in the last decade when people start to lament its downfall, its decline, its collapse. And this focus on liberal order and its possible or supposed decline led to outpourings of quite angsty sentiments and a huge literature on liberal decline, both from liberals themselves and from critics of liberalism. And I found that was in the first instance interesting, but also that there were some problematic questions that were raised by that, and not just intellectually, but politically. And I suppose this is the debate then that I sought to intervene in some way, and I'll come to how I was intervening, or let's say the position from which I was intervening. But the first question that I was asking was, let's say, what is the cause of this turbulence? In other words, is this crisis? Obviously, the term crisis itself has been banalized, but what is the nature of this crisis? Is this liberalism itself in crisis? Certainly, I didn't think, and I don't think that it's the end of liberalism. But what is the nature of this crisis? Is it a political crisis? Is it a crisis of ideology? Is it a crisis of imagination? Is it a crisis of legitimacy? Is it just the recurrence, perhaps more frequent recurrence, of capitalist crisis and secular stagnation? But what is it that's going on in particular in relation to liberalism, and what was, or what were the forces of order over the last 40 or so years? In the second instance, then, I was asking a second question, which is, why is there this confusion, or what seems to me to be a confusion about crisis? Why is it that on the side of liberals and on the side of their critics, there's these affirmations of the inevitable disappearance of liberalism? And what does this say? And a sense that, in fact, this was connected to a metaphysics of our time, particularly a tendency towards a certain kind of idealism that itself was mystifying, I suppose, in the conventional sense. And underlying the surface of the narrative, there is a question that I suppose I'm posing not only to the reader, but also to myself, about what is an appropriate metaphysics for our time. What is the nature of the real as we're engaging in these discussions about political turbulence? And then thirdly, I was asking a question about imagination. So if as I propose in the very first segment of the essay, that imagination itself plays a role in the past, has played a role in what could be referred to as liberal declinism, what has been the role of imagination in historical process over the last 40 years in particular? And I suppose here, what I'm trying to engage in is, or a contribution, what I'm trying to make is a contribution to a materialist account of changes in imagination, collective political imagination over the last 40 years. And there are plenty of people who have been engaging in discussion, debate about this. But I suppose I was trying to do so in a way that considers not only the possibilities that emerge from changes in material circumstances, but how those possibilities relate to the effective conditions produced by capitalist development. And hence, in the title, the term melancholy. Just another word on the title. Notes on our Melancholy Present. It was originally fragments on our Melancholy Present. And when I was talking about the form replicating the argument, the idea wasn't to write in fragments as a sort of celebration of fragmentation in particular. As I said, there was a sort of instrumental function to writing in that way. But the word in that title that's been most questioned is our so far. Why notes on our Melancholy Present, particularly if I'm proposing to be speaking within the register of our time. And here, I suppose, is what I feel I'm offering as something slightly different to the discussion of a social mood that has emerged over the last 10, 15 years in particular. And that is to think about changes in the structures of feeling that reflect something collective, despite the condition of social, political and economic fragmentation. So that was, let's say, the political and intellectual motivation. I was, as I tend to do with my writing, I was responding specifically though to, I suppose, three writers directly and one perhaps indirectly. The first is Samuel Moyn and his writing on the last utopia, in particular, on human rights as the last utopia. And I'll come back to these authors. The second is Paulo Eduardo Arantes, and not just his essay on the new time of the world, but a series of writings and then presentations, lectures, lives, as they're called in Portuguese, on the age of emergency and its implications. Indirectly, Christopher Lasch and his work on the culture of narcissism and diminishing expectations, but then also directly Pankaj Mishra and his book Age of Anger. I think in different ways and to differing degrees, they're each right, and at the same time, I think they're not quite right enough. In some way they're right for the wrong reasons, or they're right but they don't take their conclusions quite as far as I would like. And I say that bearing in mind my position with respect to these these giants of their own field. So I should say something about why I was asking these questions, or let's say the position from which I was asking these questions, and what that says about how I was approaching them. I suppose in particular, what's of relevance here is the professional context in which I wrote this, because this was work that I was being paid for by an institution. It's the same institution that has employed me for the last 10 years or so, and it's an international NGO called Save the Children, in which I created and then led a team. It has a somewhat idiosyncratic function within the world of NGOs, certainly big corporate NGOs, which is to critically reflect on humanitarian politics and practice. That is, myself and the others who have been involved in the team over the last 10 years, we're outsiders, I suppose, posing as insiders a lot of the time, and drawing on the tools of critical theory to engage in discussion, which can mobilize the staff of the organization and others like it, who we recognize as always being more radical than the leadership. And this is a project which probably wouldn't fly in most circumstances, but I happen to work with somebody who, my boss, who has provided a degree of protection. So the work that we've done over the last 10 years has been increasingly expanding in its scope. So while we've focused initially on questions of humanitarian operations of practice, and then on technologies, and then on the political economy of aid, this most recent project, this book on humanitarianism and liberal order, was the most expansive by far. And the reason why that's relevant is because I suppose this essay marks something of a turning point in what I was doing, and a turning point which allows me to think about the role of humanitarianism in a way that I think hasn't been discussed within much of the literature on the end of history, or the end of history, on the literature on neoliberalism, except insofar as it relates to sort of NGOs exclusively, this sort of more niche or esoteric literature on NGOs. And so what I'm trying to do here is bring to bear a discussion on humanitarianism and its relevance, not just as sort of compensating ideology for a time of increasing inequality, but trying to think about what role humanitarian politics has played in structuring the moral economy of neoliberalism. I suppose there could be considered to be something of a conceit in that, because I've seen myself in the humanitarian sector as playing the role of something like an ethnographer, critical ethnographer of humanitarianism. And so what I'm trying to do here is also say, in fact, this thing does need to be given some attention, and there's a tendency, particularly, I suppose, particularly within Marxist debate, to just disregard the role of moral practice in general often, but specifically human rights and humanitarianism as just sort of bourgeois ideology, its mystification, etc., etc. And for various reasons which we can get into, I don't think that's sufficient. Partly because it's often grounded in a sort of conspiratorialism which I don't particularly buy into. I don't buy into at all. And second, because I suppose, having worked within the institution, an institution like the one I've worked in, I've come to understand some of the nuances which perhaps can't be understood from the outside. And that's not to say that, I've become more sympathetic to how. No, I've remained as critical as I was, I think, when I entered this organization, but recognizing that, in fact, on the one hand, there are people who know this story on the inside of these organizations. There are people who define themselves as anti-capitalist within these organizations. And on the other, if the role of a humanitarian politics, and here there's a discussion to be had about what the most appropriate forms are for humanitarian politics. But if it is entirely ignored in our time, that seems to me to be reflective of a sort of quietism that is quite problematic. It's sort of waiting for the revolution to come and let's let millions of people die in the meantime, which is not only a sort of disavowal of any sort of humanist commitment, but it's almost a disavowal of universalism in itself. So that's why the humanitarian aspect is quite prominent in this essay, and I appreciate that people in this group might not be familiar with some of the literature on humanitarianism, some of the language, even the history of Western humanitarianism, but we can definitely get into discussion of that now if that's of interest. So I'll just say a little bit about what I was trying to do in response to these 3 or 4 authors that I mentioned, and there are obviously other sort of detours that I take and just views, but my central argument in this essay, if once you sort of get through all the weeds, is that the sense of historical closure that came about, I suppose, in the 50s and 60s, but then really was pronounced in theory and culture in the 1970s, and then given its apotheotic expression by Fukuyama in 89, that this historical closure, sense of historical closure, has a material basis. And of course, this, as I said, this is an argument that's been made, but it has come to, over a period of time, produce a certain social mood. And that social mood is what I've referred to as melancholia. But this closure, this historical closure, cannot itself be complete. And that suggestions that it does become actually undialectic. And that the conditions that it has produced also need to be regarded dialectically as providing, even if we're sort of pathologizing, but as providing a set of opportunities. So in response to Samuel Moyn, this historian, legal historian, but historian of ideas or intellectual historian, wrote this book back in 2000, and I think it's 2012, maybe a bit earlier, 2010, called The Last Utopia. It was a sort of trailblazing work on human rights history, in which he sort of revised human rights history. He said that, in fact, human rights came about, human rights as we know them came about as if out of thin air, or as if out of nothing in the 1970s, in the crisis of the 1970s. And so this was a challenge to all the work that either gave human rights a very long history, putting them in 5th century Athens, or their origin in 5th century Athens, or position their origin at the beginnings of modernity or the French Revolution or anything else. His argument is that human rights is the last utopia, that this last utopia, this final effort of collective imagination, came about as a result of an exhaustion of revolutionary imaginations. And what I'm arguing is that if you think about human rights as itself reflective of a change in moral disposition in the 1970s, and this moral disposition to be very much connected to the birth of a new mode of political and economic organization, through particular strategies which people have referred to as neoliberalism, that this has also been this last utopia has also been imagined as an anti-utopia in some way. It came about because this minimum that was offered was the way of suppressing the possibility of social insurgency, of social revolution. And if that's the case, human rights itself becomes subordinated in some sense to a broad humanitarian morality, which isn't only what aid workers do in response to crisis or emergency and conflict, but that it is something embedded in neoliberalism itself. And that the last utopia then becomes a negative utopia, in the sense that it was an attempt, or it has been an attempt, to totalize certain social conditions that were the negation of utopias of the past. The only possible utopia was the total negation of previous utopias, which still presents a certain horizon. Obviously, it's a liberal utopia, but it presents a certain horizon. And this is a horizon on which society, broadly speaking, set its expectations. So there wasn't, in my argument, a total closure between the horizon of expectation and the space of experience, as referred to by Koselleck. So here onto the second rejoinder that I'm trying to make, which is related to diminishing expectations in an age of emergency. And as I said, this is a reference to Paulo Arantes' work, to which I'm very sympathetic, and I know that you've discussed his work too. But the question is, how far can diminishing expectations go? Alceu Valença, the Brazilian musician, said, "Tá pior, vai piorar." Well, sure, but until when? Until the end of everything? Perhaps. But, and this is certainly not something I would accuse Paulo of, or even his more sophisticated acolytes. But there is the possibility of drawing from this idea of diminishing expectations, implications which are perhaps expressive of a sort of vulgar Marxism, a type of determinism, which I don't buy into. And partly I don't buy into that because I think there comes a moment. Yeah. Sorry, following the comments as I'm going. Partly I don't buy into that because there comes a moment when it seems to me, and this moment is the collapse of modernization starting on the periphery and heading with increasing velocity inwards, as I say in the essay, something of a boomerang effect, in fact, in which the presumption of the pre-existence of a certain concreteness, of a certain unity, needs to be radically questioned. And that is because otherwise there's a self-satisfaction to the sort of collapsism, to the diagnosis of decline and collapse, that closes the book too rapidly and then lets history go on with itself. And there is ultimately a quietism to that. And so this rejoinder is not just a sort of maybe a questioning of an intellectual premise. It is also me trying to maintain and exercise an optimism of the will. And thirdly, the rejoinder to, well, actually, sorry, I should say the indirect one to Christopher Lasch, again, whose work I have certain sympathy with, but I think Christopher Lasch has been brought back into much contemporary debate, and in a way that actually misses a lot of what he has to offer and emphasizes, I think, some of the worst elements of what he produced. I think it often emphasizes the quite sclerotic social conservatism that is present in his work. And I think there is a soft culturalism, but a culturalism nonetheless, through which he subordinates time itself to psychology. And this is something that I was trying to do by bringing in Paulo Arantes' work. Paulo only really, he uses that phrase, diminishing expectations, doesn't engage substantively with Lasch's work, at least in that essay on the new time of the world. And then finally, Pankaj Mishra, who wrote about the age of anger. Now, Pankaj Mishra, for those of you who don't know him, he's a very gifted writer, essayist. He's recently written a novel. It's quite difficult to pin down ideologically. He's been criticized by Asa Haidar and others as a liberal, but he sometimes shows certain sympathies towards more radical positions of the left, and he often takes a sort of post-colonial approach to things without getting lost in the discussion of literature and language. But his argument about the age of anger draws a lot on critics of Enlightenment. In particular, I suppose he places some responsibility for the backlash to Enlightenment reason with Rousseau and a series of other canonical figures following on from Rousseau, including Nietzsche. But while at the simplest level, sure, he's right. There are a lot of angry people in the world, and shit's kicking off. That stays more or less on the surface. And for all the elegance of his prose, I wanted to go a bit deeper than that, and engaging with him as somebody who, I suppose, within Anglophone debates in particular, has come to hold some sway, at least within the sort of glossy literary mags. And here, I suppose, what I'm doing is saying that by suggesting that melancholia is a social mood produced by, or it's an affective condition produced by the end of the last utopia, which is brought about by the turbulence of recent times, and quite specifically because of the way in which this turbulence produced conditions for something like a counter-revolution, which brought into power figures of a new right who explicitly rejected the humanitarian pact of the past, or a biopolitical pact of the past, as Rodrigo Nunes has said. That this end of the last utopia, this end of this last utopian imagination, creates a condition which is common to all, partly because there was so much buy-in across the political spectrum for this humanitarian minimum. Very few people, regardless of ideology, entirely rejected the provision of minimum standards for people in need. I'll stop there, and maybe we can get into a conversation, because otherwise I might take us off on tangents that aren't so useful to the conversation. But please ask questions, pose challenges, criticize, etc. Thanks.
Not sure if anyone wants to comment something already.
First of all, I just want to say I think that essay was amazing. I was so impressed by like the way that you linked together all of these different arguments, as you were saying, like it's kind of covering a lot of ground without also being, I feel like, I don't know if this is the right word, but it's like not totalizing in a certain way. It's, I feel like, very open-ended, but in a very constructive way too. And the bibliography is amazing. I'm definitely going to be following up on it. But something you said today and this meeting tonight that got me thinking was, you mentioned in passing humanism and universalism as values that like you sort of associate in a kind of positive way, maybe with some aspects of like the humanitarian project. And I'm really curious about like what you think about the legacy of those values or concepts, because I feel like it's become very controversial, even to, especially to assert humanism in some way, but even universalism has become very troubled as a concept. And I don't know, I feel like there's a really interesting space too with like the direction that you're taking these concepts in that essay, and like what STP has been doing in its recent work, which is and very similar. I mean, it's taking from Arantes too, right? What sort of is like the horizon, I guess, of like universalist or even humanist ideas in this sort of, you know, maybe vulgarized or like misaligned melancholy present?
Shall I respond to that, Gabriel?
Sure, no, as you please.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and thanks a lot for asking, and thanks for reading the essay too. Yeah, humanism's not at all fashionable, and there are good reasons for that. And there are people who have been absolutely vilified for their defense of humanism in recent times. Even people aren't my idols or anything. So Paul Gilroy is one in particular. Was almost chased out of the academy for his defense of humanism at one point. But obviously, humanism has a very troubled history and a very complex one, and so does universalism. And I suppose the position I adopt on both of those terms is a different one to the position I adopted a number of years ago. And I think this has partly to do with the transition I talked about, my personal one within a professional setting, of expanding the scope of my intellectual production. Because a number of years ago, in drawing on, as I say, the tools of critical theory, often the most useful tools for engaging critically with humanitarian practitioners, for whom the common sense is quite a confused one, of support for a humanist universalist premise, but a total embrace of some of the more naff elements of the sort of post-cultural turn of radical difference that often results in a sort of mimetic project of trying to find organizations in the global south that look the same as the big organizations, so you can localize what you do. And the most useful tools were often the tools of deconstruction, that is often sort of post-structuralist tools. And even the word tools probably is a bit problematic, but anyway, let's say that drawing on aspects of post-structuralist theory was probably most useful in a certain moment, even if my sympathy towards some of the authors that I'd introduced to people wasn't particularly strong. But I suppose as I've been able to expand the scope of my work, and as I've engaged certain changes or certain transitions in politics, I think most notably what happened during the pandemic. What happened during the pandemic? A whole lot of stuff happened during the pandemic. In particular, I suppose the radical rejection of the biopolitical pact, this humanitarian minimum. suddenly made me think, well, actually, there's something there's something that we should probably hold on to there, and not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I never lost, I suppose, a commitment to some sort of universalism. But I suppose I'm more than ever compelled to try and find ways, and find people who are finding ways of trying to construct universals rather than imagining that they're grounded in natural baselines, naturalistic baselines. And in doing so, not rejecting entirely the ideals of modernist projects, particularly the more radical, more revolutionary modernist projects, but at the same time not trying to hark back to those in a nostalgic way, which disregards the possibilities and even the necessities that emerge from claims to subjectivity after the cultural turn. Even if I find insufficient, and in fact often counterproductive, the postmodern response to the crisis of modernity. So in fact, this is one of my projects, and when I said this essay was an essay of transition, both in the sense that it was an essay in which I was transitioning to deal with lots of different things, and in which I felt there was a transition in course generally in the world. I am pointing in this essay to sort of 10 other essays that I intend to write, and that I'm a couple of them I'm already working on, and one of them is actually on humanism. What possibility is there of the human in the 21st century, which is obviously a huge question. In fact, Gabriel giggled at when I mentioned it to him in a recent planning session. Is the human possible in the 21st century?
No, yeah. To explain the context, we're like discussing like very practical issues we need to deal with in an organization, and he just put it on a piece of paper like, this is one of the issues I'd like to tackle. Is the human possible? Just like very pragmatic part of, yeah.
But I think ultimately that is the challenge of political philosophy for radicals today. How to relate the particular to the universal, and draw bridges between them. I think it's probably in some ways connected to, Gabriel, what you've discussed as different scalabilities, but I don't want to foreclose that what that discussion is. So hopefully I've responded at least in part to what you were asking, Anna.
No, it was super helpful. Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think it's really sort of a good key project right now, where like, because like, I'm coming out of this background where I've been really interested in sort of like the structural Marxism, the like critique of sort of naive humanism, whatever. And then I find myself kind of coming back around to some of the arguments from Marxist humanism and from like other kinds of like universalisms that might have seemed naive from a certain perspective, also just because I feel like there's a certain kind of like practical limitation of certain aspects of the anti-humanist paradigm. And I also sort of notice how like even some figures like in maybe more of the anti-humanist lineage also end up borrowing certain concepts or certain like references from humanism, like even like Zizek on like Lukács, or like Karatani's like drawing from like Martin Buber or whatever. I find it really interesting that like I feel like maybe there's like a lot of the critiques were right, but there's this question of, it's almost kind of a return of the repressed, like there might have been something kind of papered over that really needs to be reckoned with in a new way. So it's exciting to see people kind of pushing in that direction. I also kind of like the way you end the essay with the perhaps modernity strips us back to what is necessary, or dare we say it, essential. Like I feel like it's funny that like, there's been this very strong, and like I'm very supportive of this sort of like anti-essentialist turn, but the question is like, is it possible to have an anti-essentialist essence, right?
Yeah, that I think that is the question, which in layman's terms would be, is there something that joins us at all? And that is a question that you're right, I pose in the last paragraph, which is, it's not one that I give an answer to, although I do there is obviously a suggestion that yes, there is and there needs to be. So it's trying to find the possibility, let's say the seed of the universal in the individual that has everything stripped back through the modern process of fragmentation.
For sure.
I wanted to ask you to talk a bit more about a couple of connected things, because I mean, it's quite striking. I mean, I feel like I've heard before and seen this discussed, the connection between human rights and a sort of, you know, end of history, late capitalist, kind of futureless kind of point of view. So human rights as the last utopia, I think, in the sense of, okay, now we need to manage this thing. I think that there is some discussion of this that is interesting, but rarely does it look at the more mobilized organizational counterpoint of this, which is the really actually existing organizations built around this utopia, which have very particular characteristics. And in fact, it seems to me, though, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks to me like this, the humanitarian project lives in a strata that we don't get many organizations that can exist there. They are generally not, I mean, you have private organizations where funding goes through donors, and so it's connected to the private sector, that get to exist in a supranational or kind of way. So they tend to look at boundaries, exactly, names like Without Borders, you know, humanitarian aid, or all these different titles that tend to point to the fact that there's some indifference to nation states' frontiers, which makes total sense if you're backed by something which is not very respectful of those frontiers, which is capital. I mean, private money, in one way or another, right? But we don't have organizations that have that character. Like, it's hard to find a different type of organization that has that same kind of place. So it's seems to me like a very singular kind of organizational counterpart that goes along with human rights, that we tend to look at human rights as a sort of catchphrase for ideologically discussing kind of you know, policy inside countries, and as if it is, let's say, ultimately a way of depoliticizing issues back into some institutional dimension of, are we, you know, respecting basic rights of people? But that seems like it doesn't really capture what's singular about human rights discourse or humanitarian ideology, which is this kind of supranational level where a lot of interesting and very complex international politics can be discussed in a new way, and interventions. And I mean, I remember that book by Adam, oh my God, what's her name? Getachew, right? Where she discusses the history of what she calls world making after empire, right? And she tries to, I think she gives a bit of a history where a certain idea of self-determination, which was more concerned with world making and building something which is not just, let's say, anti-colonial in a sort of resistance sense of resistance, but in a sort of actually more constructive, as you were talking about, slowly substituted by something more kind of compatible with empire or with sort of imperialist structures via humanitarian discourse, getting to evaluate what self-determination really means under, you know, conditions of crisis and so on. Like, so I wanted to talk a bit about that connection, because I find that to be something very singular about the more organizational dimension of humanitarianism that usually is not really looked very much into. It seems very, I mean, I can't really think of other organizations other than, let's say, UN and its kind of satellites that occupy that place, you know?
Yeah, it's a good point, Gabriel. And I think not only is it singular, but it should definitely be understood as contingent. because, and this is an argument that's been made in a different way by anthropologist Didier Fassin, who was also vice president of Médecins Sans Frontières. Humanitarianism is the sociodicy of late modernity, and it plays a particular function in stabilizing, as I argued, plays a structuring role in the moral economy. That's not quite as simple as saying it plays the conventional role of ideology as mystification. It's more embedded than that. But in saying it's more embedded, the need to historicize the rise of these organizations politically and socially. And so you see an organization like Save the Children, the one I work for, it was born in 1919, it was founded in 1919 by a feminist socialist called Dorothy Buxton, who was also a pacifist, involved in different forms of organizing, especially during World War I. And she placed at the helm of the organization her sister, Eglantine Jebb, who since then was almost universally regarded as the founder. And the reason being, the sister was a far less radical figure. She had come of age working in sort of Victorian philanthropy, the CSO, Charity Society organization, and hadn't been involved in radical organizing during the First World War. And she was able to construct a series of relationships with the British elite in the aftermath of the First World War and then in the interwar period. But the organization expands rapidly during the famine in Russia after the war. And the reason was that the organization had unique access to Russia because of the connections that Dorothy Buxton had through members of the Independent Labour Party. And therefore the British state was providing money through this channel to Russia, while at the same time supporting opposition forces and white Russians, etc. The reason why I mention that is because where the organization then goes in the Second World War and afterwards, sort of managing decolonization, quite radical conservative turn, isn't in itself the reason why it becomes a multi-billion organization into the 1990s and 2000s. The structural conditions are what determine that. And here you have to think about organizations like Save the Children, but I think in particular Médecins Sans Frontières, and that's why I used that example in my essay, as being products of the crisis of the 1970s. And here I think Samuel Moyn over-eggs a little bit the newness of human rights, but certainly as organizations, the changes that occurred in the 1970s and in fact really in the 1980s and early 1990s are profound, and historians, including many I'm close to or associated with, have done a lot of work to show that in the 19th century there were professionalizing technologies within aid organizations being developed, and branding and marketing, etc. But the way in which this changes and it roots these organizations in political economy is quite different in the 1980s. What that means is that they play a role that is supported by states, by capital, by society in a way that is almost uncontested. Obviously, I'm not trying to portray the 1990s as some sort of golden era for humanitarian response. There was wars everywhere, and they were being rejected from, they were having their permission denied to act in all sorts of different environments. But certainly within the societies that provide the social base for them, and certainly the funding base, their role was almost uncontested. And what that means is that they then read this contingency as not very contingent. They read this situation as a demonstration of ultimately of progress, and that their role in the world was to continue and expand into eternity, or at least into the 21st century. And obviously the shock of the war on terror then was quite profound. And since then, they've struggled in different ways. First, politically, to gain the sort of influence that they had in the 1990s, and now increasingly economically. The financial conditions, both in terms of the support they get from corporates, from philanthropists, and from states, but also from individual donors. Let's say what was considered the expanding middle class is now starting to dwindle. And I'd say this has to do with what I, in the essay, argue is an inwards turn, or an introflexion. And this is where I try to ground this process materially. And this is perhaps the point that you referred to earlier, Gabriel, when I was discussing with John a few weeks back about the logic of capital and the logic of what I've called the logic of empire, let's say, but it's ultimately reason of state. And the possible divergence that occurs in the post-war period, and that this divergence creates the conditions for, or creates the need for different sorts of stabilizing mechanisms, one of which is the rapid expansion of the humanitarian international, as it's been called.
I think John has a.
First off, great presentation, Juliano. These are really good thoughts. And I wanted to kind of ask the question from the perspective of a very particular issue, but one that I think, I mean, it's personal to me, but it's also like clearly symptomatic, which is the question of like trans rights, and specifically trans kids. I volunteered with some high schoolers a few years ago. So ever since then, it's been a major thing. And it seems like in the context of your paper, it's one of those issues that kind of brings together both theoretically and institutionally a lot of these questions. Because on the one hand, a lot of I guess you could say like the kind of spontaneous ideology of a lot of queer movements have been very deeply influenced by postmodern thought, and have definitely used, I think similar to what you were saying, like there were a lot of kind of perspectives or tools of postmodernism that did really help advance questions of trans identity and defining these, like what the differences are between gender or sex or whatnot. But as it's kind of developed into more and a more mass movement, there's been a very direct shift towards a kind of universalist discourse, that what we're dealing with is a question of human rights, that we're defining the question of trans rights in the tradition of human rights. And at the same time, there's a really interesting kind of back and forth and interface between a whole set of groups, nonprofits, I think probably more in this case than NGOs per se, but still, you know, if you're looking at, say, like in the context of the United States, these nonprofits have a similar kind of mobility relative to the various states, because right now the repressive laws are generally coming at like a state level rather than at a national level. And so nonprofits are capable of kind of like mobilizing and moving between those, but they've only really kind of gotten a lot of biting power from the actual social movements, protests, high school students themselves standing up, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was wondering if you could kind of speak to those places of interface, like where NGOs and nonprofits are kind of being pushed and pulled by political movements, how they're kind of interfacing. And often, like, I think, especially in the case, I mean, the group I worked with, volunteering with trans kids, was a nonprofit. It was a very, you know, I would say militant nonprofit as far as kind of progressive liberal ones go, but it still was a progressive liberal nonprofit using all the humanitarian language that you've been kind of working through here. But very much like, especially the kids themselves, and also a lot of the people involved, like myself, were, you know, either had militant backgrounds or were very clearly on their way to becoming young commies. And so, yeah, I'm kind of curious, the back and forth, like kind of in practice between both the kind of usefulness of postmodernism, but how it kind of continually falls back and really needs the human rights language to fight for the people that it's representing, and then this kind of practical interface between the institutions with all their simultaneous, you know, tools that they have and also institutional limits they have, and then the way they interact with movements, and especially the movements that have been developing since the kind of collapse of the Arab Spring / Occupy explosion of the you know, late aughts, early tens.
Yeah, that's a great question, John. And I think you're absolutely right when you say that there is a dependence on some sort of universalism, even in the most celebratory expressions of postmodern irony and postmodern play. And I think seeing human rights as a tool is probably is the right way of seeing it, and that's because in some sense, yeah, it is perhaps an empty signifier. It's used, and it has been used certainly over the course of the 20th century in different ways and for different causes. That doesn't mean to say that there wasn't a sort of dominant technology that was built around human rights into the from the late 70s onwards, after Jimmy Carter's inauguration speech in particular. But this this dependence on some form of universal in order to gain traction, I think is right. And second, the tendency more recently to openly embrace a form of universalism, if not at least a universality. And I make very brief reference to this in the essay in its cultural form, when I suggest that what's happened isn't a reversion to the universalism of the past, but it seems to be a reemergence of the inside-outside distinction. And this is an emergent, this distinction seems to have been etched into the superficial surfaces that Frederick Jameson discussed as characteristic of postmodernity. And I suppose with reference to trans rights in particular, this would be expressed by a change from my gender is fluid to I am a woman, and that's the end of the discussion. And I have this universal basis to support me in doing that, and society will do so because that's the right thing to do, which I also happen to think is absolutely the correct position ethically. But I think it does reflect something of a turning point, and this is why I sort of developed this idea, which is an idea of a certain isomorphism, that as the directionality of capitalist development seems to change, as this divergence between reason of state and the logic of capital seems to increase, and there's something like an expansion inwards, there is also a turning inwards, and there is this point of introflexion, which is then resolved sometime around the crisis that occurs in 2008, or at least, if not 2008, perhaps a little bit earlier, around the launch of the global war on terror and the emergence of new meta-narratives. In terms of the institutional relationship to let's say, the claims to rights and subjectivity, I think there's a challenge here, which is that organizations are increasingly standing up for the rights that they once saw as insufficiently politically important, for them to prioritize. And it's in particular in the last 5-6 years. I think more than trans rights, I think the embrace of NGOs of Black Lives Matter is a very good example. But it happens when these institutions have much less political traction, and therefore their championing of rights just seems to blend in with other organizations' championing of rights. And they can't really position themselves as the vanguard of anything in particular, certainly the vanguard of a sort of middle-class radicalism, which is what they probably were 10, 15 years ago, if not a bit more. And I think this poses a challenge for people on the front line of social struggles for rights to think about where they need to invest their energies in terms of organization. Which are the spaces, institutional spaces, from which they can gain most political influence or political hold over society.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah, I have a question. This was really interesting presentation in general. I come from international relations, right? So a lot of the things that actually like were appearing felt very familiar to me in a lot of ways, but also very refreshing, because I think I even said that in the chat. I think that the main issue, at least like from the perspective of when I was in college, in the field and everything, is that there is either like a full, I would say it's like a full dismissal of whatever these organizations can do. So like, okay, yeah, these are like tools from capital or whatever, but then there is little regard to actually what they are doing, how they work and what they can achieve. So they are seen just as this like, like whatever they do is just a reproduction of their capitalist content or whatever, and they never like exceed themselves. Everybody within them is either like, it's like consciously collaborating with that, which is not true at all if you like when you have this thing. But also there is like a sort of quiet, which you mentioned really well when you explore, it's a sort of like a quietist take on it, which is yeah, that's the maximum that we can do. So they sort of become like the maximum horizon of intervention because of their scope, because of how much money they can mobilize and everything. And I think that this is a very like one of the things that I realized that is a particularly strong argument that gets reinforced a lot of the times because of the forms of funding in themselves. Like when you're going to write a grant for these organizations, and I remember that like one of the main activities that we had to do in my graduations was to actually like do a grant with a partner organization and then actually like try to do, and the exercise is extremely weird because it doesn't matter really what you are doing, like what's your cause or what's the area that your NGO supports. You just have like it's like there is a grant form and you just have to squeeze everything in there and make sure that like it fits into the financing criteria, and there is a complete disregard for whatever you're doing. So like you just have to, it's like there are so many pre-made formats for funding that you just have to fit into that criteria, and even if you don't do something within that criteria, you have to make sure to disguise everything that you do to actually like look like you do that, and that you have been doing that all along. And there are even like niches of that, I don't know, talks on effective altruism or whatever concepts are being used. You just have to comply to those concepts, and like even the theoretical life of the field becomes sort of related to what are the main grants happening and what is happening like in the world, what are the main sources of funding, what are the main organizations that are actually hiring. And like it, and even like the research agenda floats within the field of international relations, right? So if you look, for example, like now in Brazil, there's a spike on people working, like I think for like 10 years now, after Haiti in particular, but then after the Venezuelan crisis, like this is spiking a lot right now. The research is majorly focused on issues of migration. So like everything that happens within the field happens within the field of migration and everything, and like sort of becomes this huge cultural thing within the field. So one of the things, because I see that there is something like within your presentation, which is sort of like the the potential of what these like forms of articulation that are done under the guise and under the flag of international human rights and whatnot could actually be, if you like, what has been your experience with funding itself? Because like obtaining funding itself becomes this sort of constraint in which you almost have to change what you do in order to be like amenable to being funded. So, your experience on that?
Yeah, so I was giggling because I do have I do have a fair bit of experience in that, but I have some particular experience of relevance, which is recent and is a very relevance in particular to a project that I've been discussing with Gabriel and a few others. So just to backtrack a little bit, you're absolutely right that there are sort of pro forma log frames and etc. that people have to fill in. Aid workers have to fill in order to get grants, to be able to report back on the grants and carry out the work that they profess to want to carry out. I think this whole new phase in humanitarian bureaucracy, which came about in the late 1980s, is perhaps most demonstrative of how humanitarian agencies came to function as vectors of a particular ideology. In fact, very specifically of neoliberal ideology. And this is I actually did a 2-year research project on this very topic. When I said that eventually we got to discuss, came to discuss the political economy of humanitarian aid, we focused on what we called the humanitarian effectiveness agenda and how that came about. And our argument was ultimately that while there was a commercialization of humanitarian organizations, there was also a progressive humanitarianization of the professional world. And this was because humanitarian agencies were among the first to develop neo-managerial technologies of organizational development. So for those of you who have come across, who have read about sort of public bureaucracy, there was a new approach developed to public bureaucracy and public finance that I suppose came to prominence most of all in the UK in the 1980s, called the New Public Management. That was at least in rhetoric, placed in opposition to the sort of centralizing tendencies of Fordism and what came after the First World War. McNamara's reforms that were very influential in public bureaucracies in the West. And the idea was that increasingly there would be a decentralization of state bureaucracies. And these state bureaucracies would depend increasingly on middlemen, middle people, on managers. And this would mean that the political influence over state functions would be reduced. What actually happened in the public sector, as well as in the private sector and third sector, where this was this approach was increasingly adopted, was that there was an expansion of bureaucracy as this decentralization came about. There's an expansion of bureaucracy to manage the decentralization that was being promoted. But it was perhaps humanitarian agencies after international economic organizations that developed this approach most rapidly. And so by the early 1990s, following demands for improved monitoring mechanisms, evaluation of aid operations, humanitarian agencies invested a lot of money in professionalizing their systems, their people, their programs. And while we criticize this tendency in our research, it's also necessary to think in hindsight about what's missed when the critique of neo-managerialism is developed, and it can rapidly sort of become a critique of all processes of standardization, of all forms of hierarchy, of all forms of management of difference. And I think that's what's led in some sense to the confusion that exists within aid agencies, within their bureaucratic process today. Yeah, I don't know whether it's worth me talking about the relationship, Raphael, the relationship between aid agencies as vectors and internationalism, international relations in general, or let's say geopolitics. I think it's a more complex conversation. But sticking on fundraising, it's a game that's played. We call it in our research, we call it a dance with donors. Donors claim to be following a set of protocols. Humanitarian agencies then develop their proposals in line with these protocols, which donors, particularly state donors, much more so than sort of private philanthropic organizations or foundations, don't have the capacity to check up on. So humanitarian agencies become their own best police forces. They establish constraints for themselves about what's possible, what's not possible, for fear of losing political influence with the donors, who also happen to be those who can change the world because they have political power in the eyes of the leadership of NGOs. And so recognizing that, it becomes a lot easier to play the game, provided that whoever is your line manager in an organization gives you some sort of support to be able to play the game. And that is usually not the case. In my in my case, I have had that fortune. And so, for example, recently, we've managed to get some money to establish a new institute, which is the thing that I've been discussing with Gabriel, based on an outpouring of compassion and money from European citizens in response to the war in Ukraine. A whole lot of money that couldn't be spent on operations. It's too much to be spent on operations in the country in which the war is too dynamic still to be able to determine what can happen a year or two down the line, and in which neighboring countries have a sufficient or incipient welfare state to be able to manage asylum and the needs of refugees. And the Institute isn't restricted to responding to the war in Ukraine. In fact, the scope of the organization is much broader. That becomes a sort of just a hook on which we intend to conduct our work. So it is possible. You have to learn the lexicon. You have to learn how to manage the forms and manage the people. But that is basically what everyone's doing to differing degrees.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the response. I think it was great. There is also one of the things I was talking about this in like the context. Just a quick comment about that also in other fields, this format of the grant and everything sort of like transpires and like really affects how things are done. Like one of the main examples, like there was I had this huge conversation with like my boss who works on like art criticism and everything, that like exhibitions themselves are becoming more and more amenable to the forms of funding that are available. So both the topics of art and like the way that the space is represented and the way that like the artwork interacts with the audiences are often, a lot of the times, actually very much conditioned by the funding in itself. So like to become more and more amenable to that funding, that becomes more and more rigorous and more actually like directives. So it's really interesting to hear like both about your project and everything. So thank you very much. I'm gonna pass, I think Renzo has his hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks Juliano for the presentation. Yeah, I just have, I guess, a comment that I would like to hear a bit what you think about, because, and it's a bit about like what's the political stakes of the NGO as an organization, taken as an organizational form, right? Because it seems to me that it speaks to, like, it's a very stable and successful and almost hegemonic form of interfacing between the state and capital and certain, like, a given social demographic or some sort of like target community. So it speaks, I guess, to the problem of how organizations relate to the state, the problem of relating to the state, and the problem of financing that organizations have, right? And if you look at, it's crazy to see how much of not only society but the left functions as having the NGO as a sort of like model, or historically like tending towards the sort of NGO. Like you have, I don't know, like here in Italy, the whole tradition of occupations and social centers, like you see how much like the ones that survive today are the ones who are now like sort of evicted are the ones that get to play the game of being recognized and sort of like showing their social relevance and getting legalized by the state. So it's being able to sort of like get into this game of being recognized by the state, like playing a certain like social, demonstrating this social relevance, right, to the, of representing some sort of like act or operating into a certain like region, and finding money that's not from the states because the states are broken. So being able to like, so it seems to me like it speaks to both this sort of like what I was thinking of calling like horizontal in terms of like interfaces that has to do with the last presentation of by Victor between like it seems to me a sort of successful interface because it's not really a state form, right? But it's a way of relating private, state, and a sort of like community. But it's also a sort of like a different kind of integration because it normal historically like it functions also as a sort of like recuperation form of political movements, right? It's this sort of like mechanisms of integrating movements into the state or in the more recognizable forms, like a form of like gaining legibility. So it has this both like, so for example in Brazil you have like whole sectors of education being reorganized by NGOs funded by like many banks and sort of like Todos pela Educação and many NGOs that sort of like are the vanguard of this reorganization of education in Brazil. And but on the other hand, I mean, so I don't want to like I'm not ready to concede that like NGOs are like completely like a form of recuperation. I think it's more complicated than that because I don't know, like one example that to me is very striking is how like the indigenous movement in Brazil, as far as I know, like a lot of it relies on external funding, right, from like Norway, from European countries, and they are today one of the most radical and most like important political movements in Brazil. So there's this clearly, and like my friends who work at those movements, they are basically like managers of this money and like doing the reports and like showing, like doing reaching the targets that they propose and getting new money. And on the other hand, there's this sort of like two-sided, and that's why it's an interface, because it seems to be like the indigenous movement is sort of a body that has this interface given by mostly like white sort of like technicians and anthropologists that sort of like interface to the states that are abroad to get money in order to like actually finance like radical actions, like and all sorts of like assemblies and the whole opposition that the indigenous movement plays. So yeah, I just wanted to hear from you a bit of like how do you see politically the NGOs as an organization form, like whether we have to find like new ways. And I know it's like that. Okay, like I just when I like, how do you see it as? Do we have to find like new ways of solving this problem of of relating to the state and getting finance, or do you think that part of the NGOs are already like part of, it's already a sort of general form can be used? Yeah, I don't know. I think it's more or less clear where I'm going.
Yeah, and it's actually a point that I made in the final conclusion of the introduction to the book, which is that that it's necessary to consider what a humanitarian politics might look like if it were to be given a different organizational form, and that it's necessary to defend in some way a humanitarian universalism in the way that I discussed previously, without being attached to the organizational form that is the corporate NGO. Now, I very openly, even within NGO discussions, say that my view is that NGOs shouldn't exist. That's not the same to say that they need to put themselves out of business. They are certainly mediators, and they have long been mediators, charities in general. And the difference between a charity and NGO is really just sort of temporal things. People in NGOs often say, no, I work in solidarity, I don't work in charity. It's about dignity, it's not about compassion and all this, but there's discursive differences. But they are certainly, they're forms that mediate between capital and its institutional manifestations and society in general. But at the same time, they are perhaps the most, or the truest, I was going to say the most honest is probably an ambiguous word in this context, the truest institutional expression of civil society itself. And this is why often NGO people talk about civil society as if it's just NGOs. It's also why in a podcast that I did related to this essay, but sort of focusing more on questions of violence and on what I referred to as the society of the humanitarian minimum, also in this essay, I challenged the idea that neoliberalism marked the end of society, that Thatcher's claim that there is no such thing as society is actually, it's a sleight of hand, because if you think about what the social cultural project of the bourgeoisie was and continued to be at its let's say the inception of its political project, it was at least as far as Koselleck argues in his book Critique and Crisis, which sort of established a dualist conception of opposition to the absolutist state. What emerged in the salons and the Masonic lodges was an attempt to impose or superimpose a morality over politics. And the moment when this really comes about is precisely the moment when society is deemed to no longer exist. That is in the late 1970s, early 1980s and onwards. Moral hegemony over politics is I think how I would describe neoliberalism in a way that doesn't undermine the economic aspect, but certainly adds a different dimension to it. This mediating function, I don't think that when I say I don't think that NGOs should exist, the reason why it's different to the way in which the argument is developed by most NGO executives is that there is a tendency to, in saying that NGOs should no longer, they should put themselves out of business, that it's Western NGOs that should put themselves out of business. That is their critique of themselves, of their own organizational form, is that the problem with it is that it's neo-colonial. therefore what should exist instead are local formations that are ultimately, as I mentioned a bit earlier, they're sort of mimetic in their form. It's NGOs that grow in the West, that are funded through corporate mechanisms in the West, looking for other organizations to emerge that look like them, so that then they can say we're no longer engaging in neo-colonial practice by sort of continuing on one aspect of what occurred under empire, which is the sort of missionary aspect. When I talk about a different organizational form, I'm trying to think about what role might, and you can call it humanitarianism, you can call it humanism, but what role would the idea and the possibility of something that binds humans play in radical organizing? And that could be a continuation of what exists already, or an expansion of what exists already. But how can that element not be lost within all the quite raucous discussion of post or anti-humanism?
I think my question has to do with that, because I actually wanted to try to combine this discussion with the kind of big backdrop of the essay, which is, you know, I mean, there's all this talk about kind of the humanitarian kind of paradigm, but this is all discussed in the background of this big kind of tectonic shift in the experience of the future, kind of presentism, melancholia, and specifically, as you mentioned before, under the specific vision of this, where this is not, let's say, treated as a sort of disenchantment or kind of political psychology with, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall or something like this. This is actually given a material basis that kind of requires us to take the end of the future, or to take even Fukuyama, as you said, you know, to embrace him with a careful. It was a very sexy scene that you described of you embracing Fukuyama, tenderness. Yes. So what I wanted to do is to try to. I mean, I was kind of just doing weird scribblings here, but as we were talking, just to try to localize a bit what we've been discussing in this. If you think it makes any sense, this is something I think. I'm not sure if we discussed it in this way exactly here in the group, but I find it like a useful depressive little image. Here you have two axes. One is how different is the future from the present, and here is how far is the future from the present. And I mean, this is kind of a schematization of like the Kozelek dash Paulo Arantian dash kind of many other people's kind of approach, which is to suggest that there is this decreasing of expectations, and it kind of can be indexed by these three kind of big paradigms or words, which is revolutions, wars, and crises. We can kind of see that revolutions tend to play a very strong difference between present and future, usually a revolution in the sense that we see kind of rolling out of the tongue and in the imagination up until at least the famous June journeys of 48 and the springtime of the peoples, is the difference between an order that is already known and an unknown future order. But the time, so it's very different from the present, but when it's going to happen, it's not very clear until the moment that the time arrives, and then it doesn't happen and things start to shift. But you have this very strong difference between the present and the future, but a kind of, especially because you're kind of secularizing something that appeared a lot in kind of, for example, Christian discourses in Europe and Western kind of mentality. So there is something still very much with this idea that's barely in history, right? This is almost the novelty. You moved from something which was totally different, it was infinitely different from life, which is life after death, and infinitely removed from history because it's kind of in eternity. And now you have like this huge shift where this seems to be happening in time and to be a social difference, but it's kind of diffused when it is. I mean, it's at least diffused compared with the next paradigm, which is slowly developed between, let's say, this moment, and it kind of ends with the, I mean, this is kind of Gunther Ander's idea as well. It ends with the atomic bomb. And in this moment here, you have kind of the establishment that no, revolutions are not, it's the history of revolutions are not in the very distant future, and they're not unimaginable in their content. They're quite imaginable. And they are actually the distance of a war away. Like you get, in the beginning of this, like around 1860, 70, you will get Engels talking about there will be a revolution and then there will be a civil war. But by 1920 something, you get Lenin talking about there will be a war, and that's how a revolution will happen. So the war now indexes when the revolution happens, but it's no longer a matter of producing an unknown order. Like when Lenin was talking about with this war, the revolution was going to happen. He was talking about a specific social order. He kind of knew what it was. So it's no longer an unknown order coming from the future, but a different order that you can choose from. There is either liberalism, fascism, or socialism. We know what it is. So it's no longer unknown, totally different from the present. It's different from your present, but it might be already happening somewhere else, for example. Right? And then we have, let's say, from 45 all the way to our time now, something which is no longer like the future awaits us with an unknown order. The future doesn't even await us with a different order. The future simply awaits us with no order. So you are always pitting the present against total chaos. So you can pass on policy, economic austerity measures based on the crisis is here. Either you do this or it's total chaos. You never pit the present against something that has an intrinsic order itself, right? So I just wanted to kind of localize this kind of descent of expectations in this kind of storyline, because first I think it kind of is kind of implicit in a lot of what you're presenting there, but also because I think it helps to bring two things together. The first is what I added here with this two asterisks, which is something we were discussing, I think, the last meeting, when we were talking about this transformation, which we call like an alignment or a misalignment in capitalist social formations. And so we could say something like this period here that goes from revolutions giving place to war as the main form of future, it kind of coincides with the formation and consistency of what we call society of work. So it's the establishment of nation states backed by, capitalist expansion, is the idea that, well, monopoly capital is simply expanding and taking with it this form, which kind of with the same normative principles for your life world. If you behave in a certain way, you pretty much align together what it means to be a consumer, what it means to be a citizen, and what it means to be a worker. So these things tend to align as capitalism expands, and more people tend to have this homogeneous experience. Whereas we can mark, let's say, the second period here. Of course, this is I'm simplifying everything a lot, but you can kind of mark this transformation of war towards this crisis moment into the crisis of society of work, where the ways we're going to kind of map together nations or communities, states, and our place in before the law and our place before capital in production, these things don't align anymore. And you might need, some weird normative injunction to belong to your communities and to deal with the law. Then you need incommensurate normative principles to deal with legality and to make money at the same time. These things don't align, right? That seems to be kind of what we call this crisis of work or vulgarization thesis, this idea that there's some homogeneity you cannot count on, right? So you can imagine this being like this incompatible kind of arrows that you try to stitch together the social terrain, right? And it seems to me that though that I'm saying all of this to create this panorama where perhaps some notions can be put in. So the first thing that I think it's kind of more on the practical side is that it seems to me that from your essay, we can see humanitarianism as an ideology and as a kind of project being kind of born at the end of this moment here, the turn of the century. But what we're seeing and what you discuss more directly is how it needs to function under a neoliberal rule as a way of managing this sort of misalignment here in critical situations, right? So I wanted to know if we could talk a bit more about that. But that's the humanitarian side. And then the other side, which I think connects with what Anna was bringing up, is that humanism in this period here was not a complicated word in the sense, like humanism wasn't, it was, the opposition was, humanism is, let's say, a matter of inversion, taking something away from the transcendental, putting it in the world, right? That was the operator. We're no longer assuming that it's kind of religious, transcendental, and you're putting it into the world. And in this period here, it seems like the word human is caught up in a problem of displacement. And you're never talking about human in terms of inverting what was transcendental towards the earth. You're trying to undo a self-centering because you're actually determined from somewhere you don't know, language, the periphery, whatever, right? So this is, let's say, it looks like this is what's happening with humanism, and the yellow is what's happening with humanitarianism. So I wonder if you see connections with those things as well. So please discuss society of work, humanism, and humanitarianism in the context of 200 years of history. Go.
Well, to start with, I was beginning to become a bit offended that you hadn't yet drawn a diagram. So
do you know Roda Viva, the guy from Roda Viva who does the drawings? Yeah, that was me as you were talking. Caruso, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Look, and I think I broadly agree with your diagram, which I suppose is a reflection in part on what I present in the essay and what I've discussed since, but also expanding on that. The question that I think I raise subtly, subliminally, is whether there is
sorry,
is whether there isn't a lag, and that is, here you talk about the space between revolutions and war as one of unknown order and possibility, or even possible revolution. But historically speaking, if we think about the material circumstances that gave rise to social revolutions in 1848, those had broken down certainly by the 1870s, by the long depression, the panic of 1873, when liberal capitalism or free trade capitalism went into crisis, and when liberals, particularly radical liberals and progressive liberals, started to bemoan the fate of liberalism for not the first time, but probably the second. And so arguably the last chance of world revolution is 1848. It's not the Spartacist uprising in Germany in 1919. That is to say, arguably, the experience, which is based on the material circumstance, material conditions, is prior to what then develops as imagination, including expectation, and even policy. So what happens with policy is that it responds to the threat of revolution, or the threat of uprising or social turbulence, let's say, that previously existed. So if you look at liberal policy certainly in Britain, but also in other slightly less developed European states in the last quarter of the 19th century, it was all responding to the threat of a recurrence of 48. So the democratic opening, the expansion of the franchise. The irony is that liberals often expressed a disappointment in this period that this democratic opening, expansion of the franchise, didn't then lead to expansion of radicalism itself. In fact, it led to a conservative tendency that lasted until at least the turn of the century. I lost your diagram, but I think I can remember most of it. So yeah, that's one question I'd have. Is it right that where you put expectation is relevant to those spaces, or actually it's expectation and is itself lagging from what happened prior? Second of all, I think you're correct about humanism, but that inversion, I think, went on a bit longer. It went on really until at least 68, if not even the later decolonization movements. And you see the refrain, which is most commonly repeated as expressed by Fanon, but also James Baldwin, which is that the dehumanizing tendency is most prevalent in the aggressor, in the colonizer, or in the white supremacist. It's that person who loses their humanity, that needs their humanity restored, in real terms, not in the sort of in terms of the fancy of missionary ideology. But I think the way you position then humanitarianism in relation to that, around the circle that you drew, I think that's the right moment, let's say. And it is with the breakdown of the work society that humanitarianism as a mechanism, even as technology, it becomes most relevant. But this is where my point about the period of postmodernism as an intellectual movement potentially being a point of inflection, or what Koselleck referred to as Sattelzeit, and this term is picked up by Enzo Traverso, which I mentioned in the essay. Ultimately, an extended interregnum between what was post-war work society and the hopes that brought with it, bearing in mind that in fact expectations were still projected beyond Keynesianism, and the total breakdown of the society of the humanitarian minimum, which is what I think we see today, with the tendency of those who were held up or brought up into a false new middle class, being precisely the people who, when they fall into a position of precarity, are accelerating the journey to the end of the world. That I think is, if anything, is emerging as the new order. It's that disorder. It's a long-term, I mean, even enough to say permanent instability, and that is because of the dislocation that you drew there. I'd say primarily the dislocation or the divergence between state and capital. Yeah, I'd like, if you could send me that diagram or put it up again. I think I'll probably have a.
Here. Yeah, I just removed because it was too clear. I just removed the snippets, but I mean, you know where it was, right?
But do you see what I'm saying about the lag?
Yeah, you know, and I also think, I mean, as you were saying, it's something I think needs to be clear, is that clearly, like this period here, for example, even let's say if you take like its limit point, right, like 1848, it is actually a moment where you have revolutions, war, and crisis all together. And it kind of makes clear that war was the thing that actually made revolution possible. And then you have kind of a two-way movement, right? There is a whole kind of, as you said, response to the fear of revolution, which sets out a bunch of, let's say, totally like it takes 50 years of, let's say, policies being developed and countermeasures being thought through, kind of answers to the ghost of what had happened and so on. Even when it was no longer possible to do what had happened, right? So there's this whole, as I said, this lag on one hand, and there's this kind of this inversion on the other hand, where war becomes clear that war is the actual existing side of revolution. You know, so it almost like you get a revolution is divided between, let's say, a state response in the sense of, we need to rework. I'm going to use the Karatani things, right? So the mode B, we're going to rework it from the answer it from the standpoint of mode B, and politically we have an idea that we're going to anticipate it from mode A, which is war, like groups going against groups. That's what we're going to do, which is kind of a dual response to something which was meant to be a negation of kind of market capitalism as it was establishing itself there, right? So there's kind of a combined answer of establishment of a discourse on national sovereignty or self-determination. I mean, the Workers' International, which is something that will develop in the first half of this moment, right? To be substituted then in the war, which again, war appears like, okay, this is the paradigm, but between First World and Second World War, we learned that actually is crises that drive wars. You can see wars being started by no one, like the First World War. Like you have perplexed people who are starting a worldwide process that they don't even know how to explain what they're doing. So there is the same way that war is behind this, you can see crisis getting autonomized from the way that it captures imagination. So it feels like it's a much more complex texture where one process is actually hidden behind the other, the process that actually excites the imagination or kind of forms our imagination, not necessarily the driving one at that moment, right? So a proper story of this would have to be much more complicated.
This is where I think something clicked there when you say crisis being autonomized. I think this is where it makes perhaps more sense for me to be focusing on the disconnection of capital from state power. That is the decreasing capability of the state to act as guarantor for capital, to provide the stability necessary to generate a platform for accumulation until the next crisis, which will happen with even shorter notice next time around. And in some sense, then it's not crisis itself that's gaining autonomy, but it's capital that's disconnecting from the state, and crisis is really the reflection of the development and then unraveling of capitalist process itself. I mean, if that were to be the case between your markers of revolution and war, you could have within perhaps a slightly shorter time period imperialism. Now, I'm not suggesting that means that one should uncritically buy into theories of imperialism developed in that period, but let's say a convergence of certainly finance capital and the state. And then in the second period between, don't worry about writing this down, between war and crisis, you have a period of financialization, which is connected to this turning inwards, in which moment the geopolitical interests of the state no longer converge with the increasing transnational tendency of capital.
Yeah, like I know Vitor wanted to say something, but just before I press, just one question, because don't you feel like there is, I mean, Renzo mentioned this idea of, and I also tried to kind of get to this, that there is something about the organizational space for NGOs that not only, I mean, you can talk about, let's say, the way that certain radical struggles are encroached in this organization, kind of mediated and connected to them, but also that there is something at the level of international existence and mobility, which sounds singular when compared to other organizations. And I was thinking if there isn't kind of, especially considering this new things you added here, there is a kind of story of what type of organization gets to exist at the supranational or the international level, right? And I mean, from revolutions to war, we're talking about, let's say, the golden period of international workers' organizations are very much based on, let's say, communities of suffering or communities of social conditions, right? Yeah. Then there will be a moment of, let's say, trying to, from the League of Nations and some attempt that the idea that, I mean, imperialism is already based on this idea that states can mediate international relations ultimately. Like you can have stronger states that get to kind of control this. And then you have this financialization process where it becomes clear that there's a disjunction between the state form as the proper way of mediating international flows of power and actual capitalist international forces. And it seems to me that this is kind of a history of also of which forms get to circulate at an international level with some level of agency, right? And it does seem like there is something about this organizational form that Renzo was talking about in terms of how NGO seems to be structured and economically how these things relate, that is very fitting for this moment, right, of financialization that is not directly backed by or conciliated with state structures, right?
Yeah. And I think let's bring Victor in, but I think the question then emerges, perhaps particularly now in this moment of apparent transition, which is what is the viable form of internationalism when neither opposition to neither the state nor capital in themselves produce the collective opposition at an international level in the way that they did in the past. I mean, not even the humanitarian internationalism that we're seeing in this period of financialization, globalization. That the dominant form of opposition to both the state and to capital is a reaffirmation of particularity.
Yeah, but I mean, just I'm not gonna say anything else, but just I find that a useful and kind of I've never thought about it in those terms, how humanitarianism is kind of key discussion to thinking internationalism.
Yeah.
Or progressive political struggles today, like.
I agree, but then I think its roots should be drawn back into the 19th century. Mm-hmm. and see how they're intertwined with even work at international. So the first international involved, obviously it was founded by a positivist, but it involved many who then went on to be sort of progressive liberal internationalists that would join forces during the First World War to oppose the war, and then would be reactionaries that would establish their own international position in counter to Bolshevism, and so that the joint roots, the joint origin, at some moment leads to a divergence, but then in the interwar period. Later interwar period, there's another convergence where human rights and more radical projects seem to come together, and in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and Bandung and then sort of third world mobilizations. But anyway, let's bring in Victor. I like that. I like that framing, Gabriel.
First, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I did not know that the former Maoists would be behind this kind of this turn of human rights organizations. And I think it's very interesting that it is connected to the end of third worldism, because I don't know if you read this book by Vincent Bemis, The Jakarta Method, because third worldism was literally exterminated. In Indonesia, over 1 million people, anyone associated with political organizations that had that kind of international leverage, they were exterminated in a way that does not align with the usual form that we analyze how capital relates to labor. Usually we think we give an increase in wages and an increase in productivity, or we repress in the European context, for example, right? We don't kill everyone and terrorize and stop them from political organizing, and in the vacuum come the NGOs. And I don't say they have an interest in or that they cover up extremity. On the contrary, they denounce, but it comes off of sort of this quietism that you described seems to appears to me as a form of survival for people involved in this kind of work too. We're not communists. We don't have anything to do with the Soviet Union or independence movements. We are for human rights. And then there are this anti-fascist thing that was still sort of in the air. But I was thinking about how Gabriel put it, the thing of the worker, consumer, and what is the other?
Worker, citizen.
And citizen, and how after these mass extermination programs, the countries where they happened, without the threat of communism, we had this threat of this formless crisis, where if the worker does not behave as a worker, a citizen, and a consumer, he is a deviant, a communist, someone that may be killed. And I was just thinking about how these NGOs relate to this. I'm not sure how what it means exactly, but I think it's meaningful that today it's very difficult to in a militarized situation to have an explicit political organization. So I think these things are related. As a practical thing, it would be impossible to enter certain areas if you do not say you were human rights. I don't have anything to do with politics. I don't have anything to do with revolution. And I don't know, there's something that I was thinking about how the populist right in Brazil says human rights for the right people, né? Direitos humanos para humanos direitos.
For the right humans.
Yeah, for the right humans, and how human rights defenders are the defenders of murderers and thieves, and it was not like that in the 70s, in the 80s. Human rights defenders defended political movements, and now it has shifted to this sort of a threat of lawless sort of crisis, social crisis, anomia, something like that. And I don't know. I was just thinking about these historical coincidences and how it is difficult to think of a political horizon when your life is on the line. To build political collective projects when you're busy surviving, and it is I experienced that very more explicitly here in Rio de Janeiro. It is surviving is a political project of sorts for the proletariat and the precarious workers here. So I don't know, just some thoughts and thank you. Thanks for it was very interesting and it was. I think I want to read more about these discussions, these political discussions that happened before NGOs became what they are now. I did not know they were so different.
I can send you a couple of other articles that I've written on the NGOs and the politics of solidarity and historical perspective. I think your last point is a particularly pertinent one to social struggle today, which is how can you envision utopia when just the energy that's required to do so but could potentially detract from the more urgent struggle for survival. And here, I suppose and one of the fragments that I'd written in the original essay, which I think will probably I'll transform it into an essay in itself, because it's relevant to work I want to do on the crisis of capitalism. It's about rupture and subjectivity, and not wanting to take the conversation in too much of a tangent. I'm not sure that predicament has ever been so different. I think it's an exacerbation of the same problem, and the idea that we can overcome the need to survive. We can go beyond the realm of necessity and then think about how to build. I don't see that as the way in which a process of subjectivization works. Partly because the moment that rupture, which is always born of necessity, occurs, and the subject seemingly detaches from the object, there's an immediate connection once again. And this is, I suppose, my sympathies for the ideas of a sort of open dialectic, or even a sort of critique of dialectical reason. That's often used, and even used by people in the moment of struggle, to suggest, look, think about the future later. Let's deal with the present. And I don't think the projects are distinct. I think that the thinking about the future only emerges from a material condition in which organization of struggle in the present points to something which is or creates a sufficient momentum to move beyond the structural conditions of today. And as such, this is where I think I go back to my critique of the collapsism, the unremitting collapsism, which is, or perhaps self-satisfied collapsism, which is that of course, if even more so, if we're saying that expectation lags behind experience, and that there is a tendency to close as a closure of experience and expectation as crisis becomes more recurrent, the possibility of the future that emerges from organizing in the present is not only remains real, and in fact, in some ways, that possibility becomes itself more recurrent. So with crisis, dialectically speaking, with crisis, the possibility of overcoming it is more present, but it becomes almost a political requirement, or even an ethical requirement of those who seek to organize. And if you then recognize that concreteness itself is not predetermined, but some form of minimum unity is the result of organization, the reversion to a position which is resistance is sufficient means that diminishing expectations, in fact, win the day. Because if this lag is the case, and certainly many different types of thinkers have proposed that that is the case, from Benjamin to Antonio Cândido to Edward Bernstein, of all people, that socialism ultimately, or even revolution, acts as a sort of brake on capitalism. If you don't have a horizon that's produced in the moment of struggle for overcoming necessity, it's a downward spiral. And maybe transcendence isn't possible, but the resignation that transcendence isn't possible itself becomes instrumental to the impossibility. I hope that made sense.
Makes a lot of sense.
So I had a question, actually. I mean, because it kind of keeps coming up like around the edges of this discussion. And like that was some great stuff, that conversation. I was really, really into what y'all were saying. But I mean, in connection with all of this stuff, Juliano, have you read Karatani's, Gordon Karatani's The Structure of World History?
Yeah, and I know that that's a significant reference for you. And I've seen here that you've mentioned him in his proposal of new multilateralism. I think there's a certain similarity between what he's discussing in terms of modes of exchange and what I'm referring to as logics. It's not quite the same thing, but the implications then that's drawn from that he draws from his analysis for in prescriptive terms, normative terms, I think there's some resemblance, but I think I'm probably a little bit more on the fence still. I think I'm and maybe I shouldn't be. But this is actually the challenge that I think I'm now trying to set myself. So to step out of the role of critique and to be more willing to compromise my positions through prescribing. What I do think, though, is that suggestion itself is pretty run-of-the-mill. I mean, among radicals. I mean, there's that I sent to Gabriel recently a meme, which I'm sure has been circulated a million times, of how Zizek's articles go, which inevitably ends up with him adopting exactly the same position as liberals, and that is common amongst people, radicals, who are trying to overcome, even in a dialectical fashion, the problems of contemporary society. I suppose the conclusion I draw from that, which isn't necessarily a disheartening one, and I think I even mention it in the essay in one line, is that in the moment of liberalism's supposed crisis is when we come to see the extent of its dominion. That is to say, when everyone's saying liberalism's dead, liberalism's in crisis, everybody seems to be a bloody liberal. And the reason why I say that's not disheartening is also because the facile critique of liberalism, anti-liberalism, is self-destructive for communists, socialists, the materialist left in general. And that's because it's largely because it's undialectic. There's no sense of incorporating what's positive within liberal capitalism, within liberal societies. It's a sort of start from the beginning type of abolition. So yeah, perhaps the whole UN thing, as Gabriel says, isn't such a bad idea until it can be transcended and develop some form of imminent critique of liberal multilateral institutions. That didn't bode very well ultimately for critical theory, which it went down that route and then sort of reached a dead end, both in theoretical and in political terms. But I wouldn't say that route should be closed off at all.
I wanted to ask about, you said that with respect to the modes of exchange, you were talking about something similar in terms of logics.
Yeah.
And if you could go into that a little bit more, it's also sort of funny to think about in conjunction with like some of the work that STP has been doing with respect to, logics of the different modes of exchange, and like Badiou's logical triplicity stuff, and mode D kind of as that great outlier. So if you could just talk a little bit more about like what you mean by logics in that context, I'd be really curious to hear.
Yeah, well, this is a challenge to me to articulate this coherently, because this is the thing that's perhaps something I've had to put on the back burner a little bit to be able to focus on getting some other work finished, but is in some sense the bigger project, which would ultimately be the transformation of that segment of the essay which is entitled The Great Introflexion into at least a longer essay, if not a book, which would require a significant amount of empirical work that I'm quite a way off doing. But let's say the starting points, even the references, are the same. And so I haven't, and I actually came to this idea of a divergence between, or an increasing tension between the logics of capital and the logic of what I've called the logic of empire, but I've never really been happy with a framing for it. And I think reason of state is the best way of framing it. Before I read structural world history, so I suppose, for example, the idea of the gift is not at all present in what I've been thinking about, and the more that I've tried to keep up with or catch up with what you've been doing, the more it makes sense that should be incorporated. But I suppose my interest is very specifically in a tension that's created within late modern societies, or within, let's say, the post-work society. And I can see somebody was saying I was about to Rafael ask about the gift, which in fact the gift, and most in general, is there's a discussion very live in at least the more theoretical literature on humanitarianism, as an aside. So something that I have discussed, but totally separate to this project. What I've been trying to think about, and it starts out from research that I was doing into empire and imperialism in the late 19th century, and the tendency of particularly progressive liberal intellectuals to distinguish empire from the new imperialism, but to do so in a way that would save empire and save colonial empire from settler colonialism from imperialism. Obviously, that's not the political project that is behind my interest in this, but that distinction seems to me to be relevant, and the fact that it's lost within theories, particularly Marxist theories of imperialism, despite it being very present in the work of Hobson, who was obviously then influential on Lenin, Bukharin, among others, is, I think, one of the reasons why we see today a very anachronistic reference, citation of imperialism as a sort of reified category or concept that can be just deployed to condemn certain acts in the global south in particular. But trying to distinguish between those elements that are specifically to do with capitalism and its modes of production, and those which are to do with a much longer trajectory of state expansion and geopolitics, and taking the investigation of that logic back to the very origins of capitalism, and trying to think about the relationship between the prince and finances, that alliance that Bradel talked about, and which in each moment, in each historical moment, prior to each moment of rupture leading to modernity and then beyond, which has the upper hand, which is the driving force, and trying to recognize that there are interests that exist first within the absolutist state, but then that continue certainly in imperial Britain, once that relationship between aristocracy and bourgeoisie changes, and the continuation of the old vested interests in what becomes the new, and they become almost hidden within what becomes the new, such that everything is deemed to be the product of the bourgeoisie's interests as part of the logic of capital. And I think if we look empirically at war in our time, I mean, even in Ukraine now, trying to distinguish that which is an expression of capitalist interests in Russia, for example, but not only, from that which is the expansionist logic of the state itself, is very difficult. In fact, this is something that I'm organizing a debate on as part of this new initiative, together with colleagues. The extent to which this war can be explained exclusively through class interests, and I tend to think that that's not the case. That you can go a significant way to thinking about the way in which social formation has placed pressure on the state to respond in a certain way, but that there's something else intrinsic within, particularly the modern formation of the state, that requires further explanation. And in fact, to the extent that I've considered further logics, it's not been compatible with Keratani's modes, because the other one that I've introduced into my concept, or conceptualizing rather, is a logic of exterminism, which would be a logic which comes about really in the post-nuclear moment. So, as total catastrophe is announced by Gunther Anders, but it's obviously exterminism is a term that was proposed by E.P. Thompson. He talked about the logic of exterminism, and I use it in a slightly broader sense, but that is an autonomy that machines developed.
Sorry. We're like, astrologer. Like there's nothing you can say that doesn't fit the Karatani astrology horoscope. Horoscope, yes.
That is an autonomy that the machine develops, which is actually, I mean, here we begin to see the entanglement of these different logics, because obviously the autonomy of the machine is also partly a product of industrialization. But anyway, I think that's maybe I won't go more into that. And I hope I've at least gone part of the way to answering your question.
Yeah, it's really interesting and helpful. The only thing that I would maybe follow up with is like, what like are the specific, like you talked about logic of the state and like logic of capital as being different things.
Yeah.
I think that that analysis of the Ukraine war is really interesting, and I'm pretty sure I agree with that in broad outline. And then you mentioned like logic of extremism. Is it like those three that you're focusing on, or are there like others? I'm not sure I sort of got like the full synoptic picture.
Well, I'm not sure I've got a full synoptic picture either, but those are the three that I've been focusing on, largely because this, as I said, this project, if it is to turn into one, has its beginnings in study of empire and imperialism, and trying to think about how changes in modes of imperial expansion, state expansion, external state expansion, relate to ultimately to the collapse of modernization, but certainly also to processes of financialization and globalization, transnationalization of capital. So it's I suppose here I'm also exposing slightly my my reluctance towards developing a fully systematic theory of these logics. But who knows? Maybe I might do so when I have the time, or if I develop the patience, as I said.
No, I think that's a really exciting project too, because like as useful as Karatani is, like I think it's definitely the case that, you know, other sorts of approaches to social logics could also cast a lot of light. And like I love that sort of focus on it through the lens of imperialism. Like what other things can we dig up maybe from that perspective that wouldn't necessarily be visible from kind of presuming the framework that Karatani applies. Yeah, no, so that does sound really interesting. And I think also sort of not presuming there to be some kind of totality that like will find the key to uncovering and sort of just exploring in whatever way, like what kind of results we get from pursuing the lens of inquiry, I think is really great. So I'm like looking forward to hearing more about how that project progresses. So thanks.
Yeah, it might take a couple of years, but I hope hopefully I'll get there. I've got some other essays I need to get out the way first.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question, Juliana. I thought your essay was like everybody said, it was really enlightening, especially in regards to clearing the picture of the centrality, I think, of NGOs in the international sphere. And I was thinking a lot about some former discussions we had, especially in I think John will remember, Gabriel, and it's a pity that Vitor left, because there's this distinction that it's in regards to the gift giving problem, to the mode A, which it seems that like there's this whole thing on Karatani where when he's talking about the mode A in the more modern formation, I think it's really weird because you have state, you have the capital formations, and then you have imagined communities. And the imagined aspect, I think, is the weird part, because it seems in a sense that, well, there are imagined communities or imagined interactions, intercourse in regards to gift exchange. But something that's been being highlighted, I think, especially in Michael's work and also in John, is that there is also some sort of real community, in a sense. It's like there's a mode A that is being, in a sense, I don't know if it's being invisibilized or whatever. But what I was thinking in when you were talking, especially two things. First, it seems that NGOism and humanitarianism it seems like it's an imagined community in a global sense. I mean, it's the closest thing we have. Like, I mean, you can have all sorts of rational arguments as to why that would be the one thing that would be shared by all humans, etc. So I think there is a really interesting aspect where it does occupy that function of being a synthesis in a moment where fragmentation, where dispersion, where vulgarization, to put the thesis that we've been working on, has been rampant. So I think there's this first aspect that I think your work really highlights, that there's really, it's like, it seems like people are like really doing a lot of work to cover up the fact that real communities are being vulgarized in increasing ways. So I think that's really interesting aspect of what I got from your reading, and I think also the end of the history, the ends of history vibe. I think there's a really good, interesting aspect that your work really highlights in a very concrete way. Not only in, oh, history is ending, there are no expectations. No, I think you give a really material rendering of this ending. But I was also thinking of something, and it's something that I'm not quite so sure, because I haven't gotten back to last week's presentation. I think Vito's presentation was last week, right? I don't remember.
Yes.
But we had a very, very interesting discussion in the difference between science, belief, about what are the differences between what is it? Terraplanismo? I don't remember, but
Flat Earth
fake
theory.
science. Yeah, flat Earth theory, and the costs of doing science, which are very different. And I was thinking, if in a sense the type of work that humanitarianism is doing as an imagined community, if it could be something akin, similar to the work that flat Earth theory is doing. And I mean, because I'm trying to think through the law.
He drops that and then he leaves.
Muted himself.
Well,
sorry, guys. I think I just pressed. I was such a bomb. I was like, oh my god, I gotta go. But I think that there's really something interesting, because in a sense, it does seem like, oh, this is something that's easily accessible. It doesn't make me go, I don't need to go anywhere to believe in humanitarian values. And the connections I have to make, they are not as costly as the ones I have to do in order to do social bonds that involve giving and taking real gifts, in a sense. Like, and I'm actually, I have this in my mind, and I'm sorry if this is like too much, but I cannot not do this. So what can I do? I've been reading.
Don't do. Okay, I thought you were gonna do the Nathan Fielder one.
No, it's just gonna be Plato. Because I'm giving a lesson on the Republic tomorrow, and the first guy in the dialogue, which is Cephalus, he's a guy whose definition of justice is basically being just is like just having enough money to not being able to dirty your hands. So it's not really costly. I mean, I'm of course I'm synthesizing here, but there's this aspect that it's a very cost-free solution, because money does all the work for you in that. So you can have, like, you pay for the taxes, you help people out, and you don't really have to really worry too much about doing bonds and giving and taking and going to war, etc. So I was thinking that maybe there's something, I don't know if you thought that was too far-fetched, but I think that maybe the connection between belief, like, and belief in the flat Earth sense, that's something that maybe we have to organize, or maybe I want to get to that more systematically. But I was thinking that the distinction between imagined communities and humanitarianism seems like a global imagined community in some sense, and like other types of social bonds. I mean, I think there's maybe I don't know what you think, but that's something that I was wondering in your presentation and also hearing you guys talk.
Thanks, Rafael. So I should start by saying that QAnon and its hashtag Save the Children campaign had nothing to do with Save the Children. The organization. in case that's what that was the direction you were
No.
No. I think I entirely agree with you, and I entirely disagree with you. The bit that I entirely agree with is that there is a similar function that imagination plays in establishing a sense of community through the generation or reproduction of beliefs. And again, to refer back to the essay, there's a moment when I talk about this reemergence of a meta-narrative and conspiratorialism filling the gaps. In some sense, no, I did. Sorry, I was laughing at Rafael's comment. Yeah, well, I think that's the thing. It's certainly the default or automatic position of the established left to disregard those sorts of wacky ideas as part of epistemological breakdown or whatever. But there is a sense in which the new messianism, which I describe, at least in its francophone variant, but also, in fact, this was British and American NGOs a bit later on, their messianism starts to play the role that was played by previous total descriptions of societal change, and in doing so, they're able to build a community of belief that presents as if it's disconnected from any material process. And I think this is the bit where maybe this isn't what you were saying, but the possibility that an imagined community can come about through force of will, or through some form of transcendent intentionality, is, I think, actually that is the position of the established left. The moralistic critique of flat earthers, which is a form of automatism, is missing the point. They're radically missing the point in political terms. Because it's not to say that today's cultural warriors on the right have some grand modernizing scheme on which they're that is the sort of the driving force of their political project. It's the opposite, though. That's where an inversion has taken place. What I mean to say is the new meta-narratives that exist, and I'd include in this, to the extent that it does offer one, humanitarianism, are part of an ideology of steady collapse, and it's or in fact often accelerated collapse, but that's an ideology that is rooted in the real process of demodernization. And so, in fact, in Brazil, we see that in starkest terms. And this was something that Silvia Viana suggested in a debate a couple of days ago online on YouTube, where she pointed out that, in fact, someone like Bolsonaro, he's often accused of being a liar, but in fact he's telling the truth. And people go along with him, not because their beliefs are disconnected, but in fact they attach themselves, they're drawn to the project, which is the project of accelerating to the end of the world. And just to, to take a further detour in that direction, I think here's where, Gabriel, you asked me right at the beginning what I thought of, or if I'd seen the debate, and I said, yeah, I thought it was the debate that is between Lula and Bolsonaro yesterday. And I thought that Lula hadn't been very prepared, but I think this is also a broader problem with the campaign, Lula's campaign so far. I mention it because it is hopefully relevant. And that is the cultural war, certainly for the left, in the cultural war, strategy holds a lot more weight than tactics. And if the established left, which is in the predicament that it simultaneously has to stand up for an existing order, because that is the order that guarantees minimum of survival, and needs to reposition itself as an insurgent force to engage with anti-establishment sentiment. If it starts to function on the basis that these imagined communities can be disconnected from any sort of material process, they play directly into the hands of the cultural warriors of the right, because they are the only insurgent or even revolutionary force of our time at the moment. And so radicalization, when there is an asymmetric polarization, plays necessarily into the hands of the new right. Sorry about that detour, but I suppose it's indirectly relevant.
No, I think it's very relevant, man. And also just to, I mean, I know we're coming to a close just because we've been here for 3 hours, but just as you were talking, I just got a link. Someone sent it to me, and I just wanted to share with you. Look what came out today. Look at the title of his latest text.
the guy's made quite the career off that claim.
This time
didn't he backtrack like sometime in the last few years?
Yeah, yes, he did, and now it's serious again.
Oh man, this
was published today, like less than 12 hours ago.
Oh fuck, I love this. Yeah, because what you said, Julian, was really good, because in a sense, I really love this image that Vitor is like the Janoni's, how do you say? He's not a fan of Janoni's. He's like the wine taster. He knows, he goes into the deepest, darkest places of Brazilian politics. And he describes Janoni with an image which is very rare, I think, in the left, but in the right, as you said, it's pretty much more alive, which is like the end of the world has happened. So if the end of the world, and I think Gabriel also described Janoni's this way some moments ago, which was like, if the end of the world has happened, I have to behave like the end of the world has happened. And so I will be yelling, I will be screaming. There are no more, there isn't space for acting in a way that performs the existence of like Lula. Lula is a candidate from another world. And I mean, that's all we have, but and I think in a way, what I was thinking is that there is this very, and I just don't like these end of the world. We were actually talking about this, a friend of ours, about the pillaged communities. But this is another topic. But I do think that there's this very interesting form, and this is, I think, why I was talking about flat earthers. The good thing about flat earthers is that they're like, oh, I know that there is a difference, that there is a truthness to the local. The horizon is flat, and I don't mean, I don't know the science that makes the Earth seems like something global and like something round. And I mean, seriously, it really does not make sense from the point of view of a normal human being, unless you do the costly work of science. So in a sense, they point to something, I think, which is the fact that we are not dealing with these mediations that science constructs in a real way. We are dealing with them generally in an imaginary way. And I do, and what I was wondering, I think you pointed in that direction, is that in a sense it seems like these ideologues, their greatest strength, and that's why I was talking about the flat earthers, is the fact that they are speaking a truth, but not a truth in the sense of, oh, they understand how the world is, how it should be, so we should all be Janones and things will be all solved. No, I think that's not the answer, of course. But if you don't understand the problem of the flat earther, I think, and the fact that it's a less costly solution, and it's a solution that makes sense in a way, especially in a world which is more and more distorted, more and more vulgarized. It makes a lot of sense if you are being more attuned to a local point of view, whatever that would mean in a translation to the realm of politics, then to simply expect, I think, that, well, left will, like, jobs will get back after Lula gets reelected, universities will reopen, etc. And it's like there's a falsity to those promises that it makes a lot of sense that it doesn't even touch a lot of people because it does not make sense. It's something that is disconnected, I think. And I think that's, I mean, maybe I'm forcing it too much, but I do think that what I got from what you were saying, and is that it seems like there's this not a more preciseness, but there's a more truth to the local that has effects, since you are actually talking about something, even if it's not the full picture. There's a picture to build again, I think. Oh, it's Janones. I will be very surprised if there are things about him translated at this moment.
Yeah.
Janon, just to explain, because I mean, you're mentioning somebody I don't think Anna and John know. Janones is
Sorry.
Yeah, just to say, like, Janones is a guy who was very ambiguous politically in terms of, he began in the Workers' Party, he went to like right-wing parties, very populist, but he has a really kind of amazing knack for digital communication and kind of it's really popular guy. And then he sided very clearly with Lula's campaign, and he's been very helpful to get across kind of sort of, and then there's an ambiguity to it, if he's being kind of fake news producer on the left, or if he is something like an antidote, because it just makes the whole digital space very noisy, but from a kind of leftist point of view. So there's a big debate around him in Brazil right now.
Is the attack dog?
Yeah, something like that.
Just John's question about Gilets jaunes. Yeah, I mean that's the thing with the new non-movements. They form imagined communities very quickly through a sort of symbolic representations, and very rapidly deform or unform, and I think that's representative of the way in which they connect to, or the type of material project they're connecting to. One that is about the reproduction of crisis. And I don't mean to say that, therefore, I don't mean with that sort of revert back once again to the sort of defeatism of the end of history. In fact, quite the opposite. I think there is potential in these imagined communities for creating moments of rupture, and doing so by connecting to a project which simultaneously provides a sufficient connection into an existing order that protects or guarantees survival, with a process of transition. Now, there's obviously a schedule for these things. In fact, just looking at Gortz's idea of non-reformist reforms, he had a very precise schedule of how you can get to that sort of a rupture. But I think the principle remains the same, and that possibility is, as I said, even more live perhaps when you think about the frequency of crisis, the recurrence of crisis in our time. If catastrophe is all around, is ubiquitous, and even if that means we're heading with accelerating speed towards a total catastrophe, each catastrophe presents an opportunity, and I don't mean that in a sort of Schumpeterian sense. I mean to say that for those on the left who are in this predicament, that is, they, in some sense, want to stand up for an order that protects life, and on the other, they need to engage with some form of anti-establishment sentiment and transform themselves into an insurgent force. It seems to me not only more accurate, but more useful to think about a sort of dialectic of the end, the reproduction of endings through a historical process, and what that means for strategy and organization.
I think that's a more uplifting way to end, rather than the other one where you ended on the right-wing revolutionary forces of the present before. Is that okay, guys? I mean, it's already 9:15. Juliano, thank you so much, man, for both for your presentation and for kind of the dealing with, dignity with all our crazy questions. And
I really enjoyed it.
It was really amazing. I mean, I had a lot of ideas. I'm gonna bother you with them at a later time, so prepare yourself. Hopefully, we can also continue talking all of these issues together here. And
absolutely,
it was really amazing. I'll send you the video once we're done, and then if you approve, we can upload it. Otherwise, you can leave it. If you prefer.
I don't like watching myself back.
Okay.
So I'll just say I approve.
Okay. We'll just write approve this message in the bottom. Okay. Guys, see you all. Sleep well.
Thank you again.
Take care.
Juliano.
Good seeing you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See y'all.
Ciao.